Welcome, everyone, to another TrueFire Live teaching session here online with some amazing educators. And tonight we've got a really special show. Uh, I know that you will basically be excited about this. So um, let's take a look at how we can get uh, kind of the interactivity going, and we're going to basically be trying to answer questions whenever you drop them. Just drop them in the chat. But let's start off. If you want to drop in the chat where you're tuning in from, that would be great. Where you're tuning in from, uh, always fun to see where everybody's watching from. And then throughout the night, if you've got questions, we'll get to as many questions as we can. But we have a great show tonight with, honestly, a legendary icon in the guitar education space. This man is so prolific, hundreds of books, hundreds of transcriptions. I'm sure you all know all of that. But Wolf Marshall has done so many different things, and many jazz players would do their best to try to play Pat Martino songs or Kenny Burrell songs. Well, Pat and Kenny actually endorse Wolf and his teaching. So not only can Wolf play and hang with those guys, they're actually big fans of what he's done and believe how he teaches and his method is something that they would endorse. So from those two icons themselves in the jazz world, it's pretty amazing. So Wolf tonight is going to teach us about some different things, going to talk about shell chords. So if you're not familiar with that, this will be good for you. If you are familiar with it, I will say Wolf has some unique insights. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in, everybody. Let's bring on the man, the legend, Mr. Wolf Marshall. Hey, Wolf, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Tommy, for that beautiful intro. Sure is beautiful to have those superlatives hurled at you. Anyway, such a joy to be here with everybody. I'm so glad you all could come out and spend time with us today. Um, and I want to thank TrueFire for having me and letting me do this beautiful show tonight for you. I want to explain to you a couple of things. We hear a lot about shell chords. What are they? I'm going to give you some general definitions. You'll be able to find some things on the internet about shell chords, but we're going to dig so deep that it's going to feel like those shell chords are only the beginning. You are going to get so deep into shell chords, and by corollary, your composition and also your comping will improve. I have a lot of students who are songwriters. They have no interest in learning to play jazz, improvisation, or anything, but they use shell chords and they want to know how to make them work to help their composing. So that's a great way too to look at it. It's one of the greatest ways you can accompany people in the jazz world, or even playing standards, or even things that are folk music can be turned into shell chord voicings, as you heard probably Paul McCartney do with Blackbird. But anyway, I want to give you a general definition and get you to wrap your head around the basic concept of what a shell chord is. Okay, with that in mind, a shell chord on the internet has been called just a one, a third, and a seventh inside of a basic seventh chord. So you have a root, you have the third, and you have the seventh. Now, what makes it interesting is the interaction of how those chords are spaced out. They form a shell in which a lot of interesting things can happen inside that shell. So this is what I think you're going to like. Okay, so imagine you have, and this, by the way, I would liken these to the power chords of jazz. You can use these just like people use power chords in rock. You can make phrases out of them. You can make riffs out of them, accompaniment figures, all sorts of great patterns. And you can pretty much apply them to any music, even music with one chord. So let me explain a little bit about what they are. And let me do it through the voices of Howard Roberts and George Van Eps. Way back when I was first studying jazz guitar as a rock player, I approached Howard Roberts at his seminar. And after attending the seminar and watching him play, I said, I've got to study with this guy. He's too much. So I went up and I asked him, and he said, you know what? I do teach, but if I were you, I would study with George Van Eps, who is the master of chord playing, kind of in the history of orchestral big band playing, as well as chord melody. And of course, everyone knows he had invented the 7th string guitar that is used now tremendously in jazz as another voice. So with the low A string. So what he did when he showed me shell chords was a progression. I want to share that with you now. Everyone knows a basic triad. Let me give you a close-up of my neck, and you can see what a basic triad is. So let's say it's a C chord here. Basic C chord everyone plays, right? Okay, so inside there is this simple triad, which is what he showed me. Okay, and from that he said, walk it up and make it into a scale. And walk it back down. Okay, simple triads. I said, well, what does that have to do with these voicings I want to learn in the world of jazz? He said, okay, take the triad, move it up. When you get to this point, add this lower note. Okay, now you walk it up, you have 7th chords. So let me walk it up from C. Okay, and from that he said, let's walk it back down. Chord scale, very simple chord scale. What you're going to find is that that is the beginning. That's how you understand where shell chords come from. Now, let me take you to the next level where you actually see a shell chord formed. Take this voicing of C and change it to this fingering. That fingering is important. And here we have the shell chord, root, 3rd, up an octave. So that triad, that note goes here now, and the 7th is in the middle. Related to this chord, you'll be able to see that very closely related. So you put those two together. And by the way, this has a lot to do with my system for the uncaged, because as you can see, the C chord can be here and it can also be here. They share the same space. So that realization is important on the guitar, especially when you play more complicated music other than just playing in one position. Okay, so let's say we take the shell chord and we walk it up now. And let's make it a little nicer. Let's use some fingerstyle. So what I did, if you'll notice, is I moved, and inside there is a moving voice. So let me show you that right now. That's a typical use of a shell chord in its basic form. I recommend you practice that way so that you can get the layout of the land. And if you'll notice, these are all simple shell chords in the key of C. So you can kind of, think of it as having some time with seashells. And with that in mind, we're now going to take it to the next level where we talk about shell chords being anything that's contained in this space. So obviously, if I move that note in the middle, that's happening inside this space. So what if I did? You can have all kinds of fun playing around with that middle voice. And that's really where you first experience with shell chords the beauty of counterpoint. Because what you're hearing is one chord and then a single note. Now that can lead you to all sorts of interesting conclusions. Like, for example, if you play this progression, you can play it this way. So you can see right away that becomes 2 chords. This is C major, and it's also, by moving this finger, it's A minor. This is D minor, and by moving this finger, it's G7. When When you play that one, you could say, oh, there it is inside here. It's just got no root. But it moves beautifully because the voices. And you can create all kinds of interesting patterns for yourself by doing that. Now, what happens after learning shell chords is you realize instead of calling it a shell, George Van Epps used to call it a three-part divided voicing, which means there's a division. The D string is muted. So if you want to, you can add that back in very simply by playing. And you end up with some nice voicings like that. That's where you can have some fun spreading the voicing out and adding colors and textures together, which is probably the most beautiful thing about shell chords is how they lend themselves to all kinds of applications. Now you find that within simple chord movements. Let's say we're going to do a very famous tune in jazz called I Got Rhythm. Okay, it's basically, if you look at the changes, just a very simple pattern like this. And sometimes people play, but you can play it this way now. And let me show you how you might do it in shell chords. A B flat. Okay, and a lot of times it's played this way. And then a turnaround. Those are some big chords, but here you can play it this way. So the possibilities are endless. Now, when we go to the next phrase in rhythm changes, by the way, you might want to check out my course on the song rhythm changes because you'll see some of those shell chords as the rhythm accompaniment part, which is very, very useful in the sense that you can see immediately against another person, mainly myself in that case, because I overdubbed the rhythm with the melody as being two different things. And when I came back and showed the comping, I used shell chords because, again, like I say, to me, they are the basic accompaniment that you want to develop for playing all kinds of jazz tunes. Very, very valuable. So I can't stress it enough. Let yourself really jump into the world of shell chords. Now, let's look at shell chords also, in this case, as being inversions. So when we play this progression here, that B diminished, very simple shape that's just like the F7. But here, the B diminished functions as a G7 or to C minor. So you get a very tight, and you can use one more to get to D. So just if you had a fast moving progression, you could realize that without a lot of clunky chords. That's through the other part of the rhythm changes tune. Now, if I wanted to go a little further, and the rhythm changes tune, as you know, has a bridge that goes to a different key, basically D7, a G7, very straightforward. C7, I'm playing it as a ninth, F7. Okay, so if you wanted to, you could take that to shell chords and play. And as you can see, fast-moving chord progressions with complicated voicings suddenly get a lot simpler. And that's the beauty of shell chords. They not only simplify and clarify, but they're economic. And so when they're economic, they're compact and easy to move around and to change things in the interior of the chord. For instance, let's imagine you had a minor tune and you're playing what would be called a typical 2-5-1. So let's say I'm playing D minor 7, E minor, A7, D minor 7. I can play, if the normal chords would be, you can simplify it to this. That sounds like, you see how compact that is? One note changes and becomes this. And then this chord, simple shell chord, A7. And so that opens up another whole interesting line of research, I would say, where you start playing rhythm figures and making them into phrases. Let me demonstrate what I mean with a particular phrase from what I call bird blues. And by the way, this is in my book, the Wolf Marshall Jazz Guitar Course, which give me a second to explain before I go into that. That book, chapter 2, is simply called Playing Changes. And the way I develop playing changes is right off George Van Epps and the suggestion of Howard Roberts. Just play all the basic progressions first in shell chords, and then you will have mobility through a variety of progressions. And those patterns then recur many, many times over, just like in a blues tune. You learn certain mannerisms, and those mannerisms keep getting moved over into other forms of the same progression. So try to get your head wrapped around that concept, where you might take a progression and color it in your own way. Now, a real good one for that is what I call the bird blues, which is basically blues for Alice. A lot of other tunes, Laird Baird, let's say also the Tommy Flanagan tune, Freight Train, uses that same progression. Let me show you what that is. If you played it in clunky chords or bigger chords, you'd have F major 7, E minor, A7, D minor, G7, C minor, F7, B flat 7, B flat, E flat, A minor, D flat, A flat minor, D flat. As you can see, it's getting complicated, but look how easy this is. And that's just a couple of times through the blues for Alice progression, which is basically a blues with a few other sequential chords. Basically, you're still doing the moves within a 12-bar blues progression, but what you're seeing is the different colors interact. So for instance, when you play over that and you use the shell chords as perhaps a reference point for your lead playing, you might play this. So on and so forth. Now, that is how a lot of folks build lines. They build lines off of chords. That's why shell chords, with their compact and very flexible nature, invite you to also tie in your melody lines. They're very useful for that reference point. So what happens is when you develop vocabulary, say from transcribing, you develop vocabulary by listening and maybe copying anything from Wes Montgomery, George Benson to John Coltrane, Charlie Parker. If that's your thing and that's what you're going to do, you're going to focus on a particular transcription, the shell chords are a great way to organize the fingerboard and put your lines in context so they have harmonic motion. What I mean by that is the progressions that you're playing against are defined. And those are easier to recall because now you're using a language concept of not spelling or saying words one at a time, but saying phrases. that mean something. Phrases that mean something convey a thought and ultimately a message, which was Kenny's big thing is he listened to a player and he said, I don't know if I hear the message. So the message is you're communicating. You got to tell somebody something through your music. And the way you would do it in the beginning phases of when you're organizing the fingerboard and playing your lines and getting it together is you need a structure in which to put your lines so that they're not random or tied to only one shape. So that as you move up and down the fingerboard, you're able to realize a new melody. And that should be something you would try. So for instance, if I play that first line, I played right off the major seventh. Let's say I did this. And I'm using this chord. And then I come to this chord. And now I'm there. B flat minor. Now we're at the top of the progression. So shell chords are very good for organizing movement and tying it right in to harmonic movement that's also in the melodic portion. You start to see the shapes. That's very important.
That is great info, Wolf. Good stuff. Good segment. For everyone that is wondering about Wolf's book and where that bird blues comes from, amazing stuff in there. Way more than we can cover in a lot of these lives. So be sure and check that out for sure. Also, of course, his uncaged jazz improv course at TrueFire. Go to the link in the description. If you haven't got that, you should definitely pick that up. A lot of great stuff in there. So let's look at one of the tunes from there, Wolf, and we're going to just listen to this. Let's roll it. And then we'll kind of take a look at maybe how you might be able to use shell chords to play the rhythm there, right? Because we're doing improv, but it's also a great way to add the rhythm in there. So Tommy, you want to roll the shell chord or the improv there? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that moment.
That's a great tune doing blue bossa there, and obviously a lot of different ways you can approach the rhythm. But maybe share with us how you would do that. Using this shell chord concept.
That's a perfect example of what you might do. So let me bring in a close up here so you can see the tune. I'm playing it in that sense in G minor. Normally the tune's in C minor, so you can just move everything to a different place if you like. Shell chords, remember, very economical and very flexible and have mobility. So down here, G minor. Okay, that's the first pass. Now, what I want to share with you is a beautiful thing that happens with shell chords because the voicings are compact and they're tight. So you can put in very easily some substitutions. Let me show you what I mean before I play it in groove. G minor, and of course you can always toggle this, make it a G minor 7 to a G minor 6. You can even toggle it up. You can go like, in that case, you just finger the shell chord differently and still mute the second string. Or you use your fingers to avoid it. So anyway, you'll do this. made a perfect, how should I say, a perfectly strong case for using the passing chords, which again, shell chords, very easy to see when you go here and you're coming from this, very easy to change. See, I'm barely moving my fingers. So you come from there, instead of going here, go here. And now you're a half step above, which is a much more, in a way, interesting color. It's sometimes known as a flat 5 sub, because what you're doing is you're basically playing what would be a D7 chord, but you're playing this. You see what I mean? Much more exotic. So if I put the rest of the chord in now, that would be the full chord. But the shell chord, again, the value of shell chords as an accompaniment can't be overstated, because what happens is when you play with a piano player, keyboard player, you need to stay out of their way. And so the shell chord in its most compact, basic formation allows you to play the information without having to play the altered notes. You're not having to do that. You're simply playing. And that's enough to keep a solid accompaniment going. You could do that when you should try jamming with just your friends who play guitar, have them play the melody or any melody, any tune, and you comp shell chords and listen to how different it sounds when you play shell chords versus playing fuller chords. For one thing, now you have phrases. They all relate to each other. They kind of belong together in a family. Again, going back to George Van Epps and the chord family. All that stuff puts the chords into phrases so that each chord is not a blob of sound unrelated to the chord that came before. Now you have a phrase. So you might have, in fact, let's look at something that you can do that's really interesting. Let me take you to G minor here, and let's say we go to C minor here, and you're going to walk it down. And how do you approach it? By shell chord walk. So again, let me put it in rhythm. And when you approach a minor third, like you do in Blue Bossa, it's great to do the shell chords chromatically. As you can see from that one, passing note. One of the classic minor. The Fool on the Hill uses that progression. A lot of Beatle tunes actually use that progression. They knew that chord change, and it's embedded in a lot of tunes. So you'll find that the shell chords start to appear in other places, in other genres. You can use that concept to help you play in a very effective rhythm. And that's useful because accompaniment is mostly what you're going to do when you play with other people. You've got your bit and you play the melody of the tune maybe, and then you play your solo, but then you've got other people playing, and then you have to become the supportive accompanist. And what that does is allows you to have that always at your disposal, the idea of moving chords around. So again, now let me show you what you just heard there. If I'm going to C minor, I can always imply movement as if I'm doing G7 by using this diminished chord going up. G, A minor, B flat, which is the same as G minor. Now I turn it into a diminished chord. Aha! That makes that progression much more interesting than just doing this. Which sounds good too, but again, you've got all this beautiful movement. To get to B flat minor. So you want to spend some time going through some of your favorite tunes and dialing in how the shell chord works. Now, let me show you another thing. With Blue Bossa, you can play the same progression in a higher register. So if someone's playing low and maybe you want to be more complimentary but still supportive, you go to a different register to allow that space so you're not both playing in the lower register. You might play up here. Now you might do something different there. So as I want to demonstrate here, G minor can be the same chord, shell chord here, is this, an octave higher. And it's usually good to keep, by the way, your shell chords for rhythm on the 5th and 6th strings, so as far as the low note. When you get higher up, you start to sound too much like you're playing a chord melody, and it could interfere. So when you play a chord melody like, that's fine to use the higher shell chords there for Autumn Leaves. That's good to do as a texture, but when you're playing rhythm and accompanying, and especially like a singer, if you're going to accompany a singer, then you can take the shell chords and add them into other chords that you use so that the colors complement each other and you can play in different registers. You see people like Joe Pass do that all the time. If you watch Joe Pass playing, there's videos of him playing with Ella Fitzgerald. You'll see that technique where he's moving his lines around the fingerboard to complement what she's doing with her voice and how the melody of the tune is, and perhaps the overall arrangement. So anyway, let me share with you what's happening here. You could go G minor and go to C minor, of course, but they're not in the same family. If you do this and you turn it into C minor, you have a partial version of this bigger chord. You have this, all the vital information. Now, this is the part where shell chords as depicted on the internet or in a lot of real basic fundamental stuff, they don't address what George Van Eps and Howard Roberts were keen on, and that is the idea of having these inversions that grow out of the first chord and form a separate progression, even though not everything has the root, the bottom has the same bass note that is like the root position chord, meaning you name the chord from that bass note. So instead you have, I'll name them as I go, G minor 7, and now it becomes a C minor 7 with a G in the bass. Okay, and then when I go to A minor 7 flat 5, I'm doing this chord, E flat in the bass. I have the flat 5 in the bass. I can play the whole chord this way, but as a shell chord, it's just this. And that is a utility. Now, when I'm in that position, in order to get to D7 altered, all I do is move my finger down, it becomes diminished. And then it goes beautifully to the G minor that looks like this. So you might want to practice for your ear training. What's really good to do is to play the basic shell chord and then practice its inversion so you hear how those are related. That's a useful thing to do. Okay, so just like playing here and knowing that you're going to go to this space and then down here, this space and this space. I'm going to actually show you in a tune how you might play that. Here's a tune that you can actually play, a very well-known standard called All the Things You Are. And as you can see, the utility of those shell chords made the melody just pop right out. B flat minor, and there's your finger right where the melody should be. And now let me show you a little trick that Wes Montgomery did that when colors these progressions you can do very easily with shell chords, and that is using a little passing figure that's kind of hard to do unless you have something compact and mobile under your fingers. So at the point in the progression, this is F minor, this is B flat minor, this is E flat 7, this is A flat major 7. So before you go to A flat major 7, think about doing this and notice the voice leading. So in context, that's our passing chord. And then minor eventually. So that's a way that you can use the shell chords to actually play a tune. That is the use of shell chords as if it's part of chord melody. And that actually happens a lot in terms of a chord melody reality, because shell chords are basic information, but you can put other combinations with it and create shell chord phrases that have their own identity. Let me explain what I may mean by that. There's a great jazz tune called Don't Get Around Much Anymore. And it's a Duke Ellington tune that has this melody. Sorry. So as you can see, the shell chords I played with my finger were this. Made it accompaniment. So if I do shell chords there, I go transition into this. So that's a concept of mixing the shell chords, which are like almost like a horn figure, along with your lead line, which is this. Accompaniment. Lead line. Accompaniment. And there it is. And so basically what you've got is the ability now to intersperse shell chords within conventional phrases or even single note phrases, and that makes it feel orchestral. That's the kind of thing you want to strive for when you develop your own maybe chord melody arrangements. Very useful for that.
Good stuff, Wolf. Thank you so much. We did have someone asked about just for latecomers, if you could define shell chords. So if you had the easiest way to define a shell chord, what would you say?
I would say I would go back to George Van Epp's. We call it the widespread, meaning that the chord from this little tiny chord becomes a much bigger chord like this. And now that spread, this spread here, is kind of the shell that contains something in the middle. So like an oyster or a mussel or a clam, it would have different meat inside, but it's still going to have a shell on the outside. Abalone. Whichever way you want to look at it, a shell is on the outside. A peanut shell contains a peanut, and inside is the information, has all those notes. And you can see you get a lot of counterpoint out of that. It sounds like more is going on, but it's actually a very simple, compact device. So the idea is a shell chord has a larger interval on the outside. A distance between this note and this note is further apart than it would be if you played a small chord like this or a small chord like this or a D chord or something. Whichever way you use the conventional chords, you voice them, as George Van Epp said, three-part divided voicing. And that division allows you to spread that the notes wider. And so you get this bigger sound with only 3 notes.
Nice.
By the voicing. Not necessarily by the kind of chord, but by the voicing of the notes in the chord.
Right. That's a great explanation. Great explanation. That's that really makes a lot of sense. So we've got one other tune from your course. Let's take a look at that, and we'll maybe do the same thing. So how would we break this down? Because I think that's really practical for everyone who want to play shell chords, apply them to maybe a song they know. So let's roll that, Tommy, and we'll break it down after that. Yeah, good
Okay,
good
yeah.
stuff. That is from Wolf's TrueFire course, Uncaged Jazz Improv. So if you want to check that out, do so. But you know, a pretty straightforward song, right, Wolf?
Uh-huh.
Pretty
Yeah.
straightforward progression. So how would we make that interesting? And as you said, maybe keep it efficient by using shell chords.
Right. Well, the idea, of course, when you play chitlins, you realize it's the simplest form of blues there is. It stays on the one chord for an entire 4 bars. It doesn't go to the quick four. It stays on the one chord, which would be C7. Then it goes to F7 for 2 bars, goes back to C7 for another 2 bars, and then the final four coming back is just G7, F7, C7, just like a blues by B.B. King or a blues that you might hear by Eric Clapton. It's the same simpler blues progression that comes from the classic Chicago and Texas style, where you really are just playing 1, 4, and 5, and not a lot of passing chords and not a lot of other tonalities that maybe make the chords more intricate. So what you're going to do is, again, bear in mind you're playing accompaniment. So we're going to use our basic shell chord, our C here, as if we're doing this part. We're going to do that. We're going to revert that to this shell chord. Now, here's what I'm going to have you do, just for some interest. Use what we call a small shell chord. The big shell chord is this voicing, but you can move it over here and you end up with this very tight little guy. I wouldn't recommend doing that on the low strings because he gets muddy. But here it starts to sound fine. So if you play any shell chords that have this spread voicing, you can make them smaller by doing. Now, another good device to do is to take the shell chord, since it's such a simple pattern, and play some patterns behind it that are riff-like, but using some chromatics. So let's say you go. And then that is a way that you could take, without going to these more elaborate chords, which is what's implied in the tune, is sevens with sharp nines in them. You would keep this and just groove. You work on the rhythm and you groove with it, and use things like chromatic. When it's on a chord for a long time, use the chromatic. So you can start to separate the chord, as you could see. I was using my thumb there because it helps me to visualize that. And when I use my thumb to play a shell chord, it allows me to put this stuff on the top very easily. Or even, and go, let's say, this shape. So you could even pop those notes on the top. So you would have that available with either this shape. So again, refingering. Here's an important thing of just general guitar insight. Try to refinger things, because fingerings are situational. Sometimes you need one fingering over another to create the most effective pattern. That's something, again, I learned from George Van Epps. He said there was no correct fingering of a chord. It depends on where it's going and where it's coming from. So and he described it as situational. So I always use that term because it's directly from his way of teaching. He looked at it as if it's a possibility that it could go almost any place, and it's your fingers that kind of dictate where the chord is going to go. Sometimes you'll do this, for instance, this, if you want to get to that note. But if you're playing this, you can't get to that note very easily. So that allows you to play the upper structure. So that has the ability, when you play this shell chord over this shell chord, or actually playing this shell chord, sometimes you'll need this one as well. And then sometimes this. It all depends on what is going to happen next. For instance, let me show you down here. Let's say you play the shell chords here, and we're going to use, instead of the G and the bass, we're going to use a small chord here because it's related to the chord that Kenny actually plays. Sharp 9. So what you're going to do is just remove the sharp 9 and play the shell chord as a small chord. And so on and so forth. And then you could also take the shell chord and practice doing it this way. If you're hearing, you want to go beyond this chord and play the shell chord like this. G7. And that would be common for blues players who are already familiar with simple 1-4-5 comping. It's just, think about using shells because they're very tight and they don't get in the way. The most important thing about shell chords is they blend so beautifully as a form of accompaniment, and that means you can play more with the rhythm feel. You're not so focusing so much on voicings. You're thinking more of the groove, and you're thinking more about how the notes go together, rather than one chord at a time with an intricate fingering, or what, it has maybe a sharp 9 and a sharp 5, like you could play this. Okay, it's an interesting sound, but it's not that effective for accompaniment, except if you're maybe thinking of it as like a horn stab. Let's say you play your rhythm here. Something like that. It almost feels like a horn section stabbing. Bop, boop, bop, doo, playing rhythm, and then you hear bop, boop, bop, ba, da. That would be something that would allow you to think like an arranger. And that was something Larry Carlton hit me 2 years ago, that when he came up with parts, he thought like an arranger, which he got from Louis Shelton. So those kind of things are important. You start to think with simple chords, think like an arranger.
Awesome. Good stuff. So you've got a bunch of guitars hanging on the wall, but we had a question about the guitar you're playing. So
Oh,
tell us a
okay.
little bit about this guitar.
Oh, this is my favorite L5, Gibson L5 from 1964. And basically, if I did a close-up of it, it's got the Florentine cutaway, which was what's happening in the 60s. So this model is particularly a 1964, and it's very worn, as you can tell by the tailpiece. And it has the wooden bridge, which I actually like on this one. I actually have a second L5 that's a 63 that is actually in the video you saw of what was the tune you played that had the very first one. Well, anyway, one of them in one of the TrueFire
Bossa.
videos. No, that wasn't that one. It was one of the songs. I guess we didn't do that one. But either way, this is it's a 1964, and it sounds really good through this ambient. You're hearing the ambient sound through the mic. It's not going direct or anything like that. So you're hearing it through a 66 super reverb amp, which is like a perfect match for it, because these guitars tend to be they can be bass heavy for the jazz sound if you play flat wounds and stuff like that. If you play this note here, that sometimes that note I find with a twin can be a little bit woofy, and that means like bassy, a little bit too much, like you're hearing too much bass and not enough clarity of the note. I find the super reverb with its 410s is a really good mate with this guitar. And sometimes I'll use a twin live. You can turn it up and change the volume. But in the studio here, where you're seeing, you're in the control room of my studio. The bigger room is over there somewhere. You can't see that. It's like beyond. But anyway, where the piano is and stuff. But anyway, that's what this guitar is, a 64 L5 Gibson, and from the model of the Florentine era.
Beautiful, beautiful guitar.
Thank you.
We basically have covered a lot about shell chords. As far as when we're talking about improv, your TrueFire course, Uncaged Jazz Improv, a lot of stuff
Uh-huh.
there. But also your book has not only the information about shell chords, but it has I mean, everything, mastering the jazz language. There are so many topics and things to delve into there. Once there you are, the amazing quotes from Martino and Kenny Burrell. Very cool. So one thing we've got a question here about when we're looking at something like Bird's Blues, and
Mhm.
you know, you talked about how you can play use the shell chords to spring into melodic lines.
Right.
So when you're doing that, where are you getting those melodic lines from? Are you thinking chord tones and arpeggios? Are you thinking scales? What are
No,
you sort of approaching
it's
that as?
It's actually in the title of my book, The Jazz Language. Scales and arpeggios are a means to an end. They're not the end in themselves any more than just playing a pentatonic scale is going to make you sound like B.B. King or Eric Clapton, or playing a minor arpeggio is going to make you sound like Otis Rush. It's not going to be enough to do that, even in simplest blues. So you learn the language. Language for me has always been something since the rock days. I've learned how to transcribe tunes, and with the tunes come the solos and the solo licks. Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Buddy Guy, those were the first ones I transcribed, were people like that. Certainly Cream and Hendrix were very big. And then later on, I got more into true blues, which and BB King and Buddy Guy were my two main guys I listened to. But the language is what's important. So when I talk about the jazz course, what I mean by that, and somebody once actually stopped me in one of my clinics and said, wait a minute, it's not a course, because at a course you have a series of questions at the end. And he was very specific because he was coming out of a college program. And I said, right, it's not a course. It's more like a course in terms of a race course or a golf course. It's a journey. It's a journey through the music. And the idea is that you're looking at the language. It's mastering the language. There's plenty of books on arpeggios, plenty of books on scales. And when I transcribed, I found that no player particularly uses one scale. They use decorations of things that might be in that scale. A scale to me is like a collection of notes you put in a box and then you rearrange it every time it comes out. It's like having a lot of different pieces. So we sometimes don't call it a scale as much as we call it a pitch collection. And that's a term that also Joe Satriani used. When I talked to him, he was had some definitely background in classical training, so he knew the theory term of pitch collection and pitch axis. So the idea is it's a series of notes that, from which you make melodies. If that's the simplest way to look at it, the jazz language is melodies and phrases. So when I have you play, let's say, Bird Blues, you're hearing a phrase in there. You're not just hearing. By the way, that's the same progression. I just realized Bird's Blues, the same progression as Billy Preston's Nothing from Nothing. So, you know, it transcends just jazz. It goes into R&B and all kinds of other styles. Anyway, the idea is you're thinking in phrases, and when you play the melody off of that, you might actually think of the phrase that Charlie Parker played. Aha, I'm on the shell. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So start here. That's right in my shell. So the A7 works. So you see how you spell that around that melody note. There's your D minor sound, and then you come down here, and then you have. Ah, there's my shell chord right there. And the next one, I'm playing this chord. Back to the main melody. I'm right there on the shell chord. So I look at that as being around that shape. Then this one, and then when you're down here, you can think of this shape as being interchangeable. That, by the way, is the crux of the uncaged jazz improvisation. You're playing through positions, but you're playing phrases so that you're never really stuck in one position as if you were playing a capo. You move so that it's fluid. And that's the kind of music I've always enjoyed learning, and the kind of music I enjoy playing, that has a fluidity to it, so that the chords become phrases, and then the melodies that you generate from the chords flow like the chord movement would. And it allows you to have more intricacy, but it also allows you to have more stability. Because when you play around the chord, you're not really just playing the arpeggio. You're playing notes that are complementary with that chord. They could come from the arpeggio. There's no reason why they couldn't, but it would sound very dry and very mechanical if I played nothing but arpeggios, and same with nothing but scales.
Awesome. Great answer. So, yeah, appreciate that answer because I think that's what a lot of players sort of struggle with. So,
Yeah.
give us, I know we're about ready to wrap this thing up, but on that note,
Yeah.
maybe give us a tip for someone. How do they get started doing that? Where do they start with trying to understand that language, trying to figure out how to do that? Where would they start with that?
You mean other than getting my book?
Well, yeah, yes, yes. If you had them, that would be a great place to start.
Well,
But if you gave them a hot tip right now,
okay, I would do this. I would use melodies that are in the language of the music as melodies that are in the heads of tunes. So when you play the heads of tunes, like I just did with that tune is called Blues for Alice, and it follows the bird blues changes. So, they're very tightly related. And so what you're looking at beyond simply looking at a melody, you're looking at the harmony at the same time. And the same thing would happen if you pick, let's say, a tune like, you end up on an A7, an A that's in an F7, just like you're playing a shell chord. So that you have that real same realization. And there you are right inside your shell chord again, where you're playing right on top of the B flat 7 sound. So, and the idea is that what you're doing is trying to tie in melody with these shell chords. Now, they make it easy because the shell chords are very compact and mobile, so you don't have to think about necessarily trying to make an intricate chord relate to an intricate melody. Instead, the melody can have all kinds of color to it, but you realize that that is just a variation above the chord. So if you have a basic chord under there, it's kind of like you always have a simple accompanist, and you're playing the elaborate, interesting part of melodic improvisation and melodic development on top of those very simple chords. So it keeps it very integrated and very relatable within the progressions themselves. It makes the melody sort of have a stability, is the way I like to look at it. It's stable.
that's a great way to look at it. Really, really good. So, awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Wolf. Man, we
Sure, my
love you
pleasure.
at TrueFire, all the stuff
Thank you.
that you've done, not only your course, but the songs you've done, transcribe them. Awesome. Your versions are great. I know for everyone's probably really interested, Wolf is actually working on a TrueFire channel.
Yes,
So stay tuned for that
please
because that
do.
will be coming. He's working on that. A lot of cool stuff there. And of
And
course,
the very first thing in the channel actually is what I call templates, and it is exactly how to do what you just described: a simple chord, and how do you play a melody over it, right into it. Simple ideas that tie together and become longer phrases.
that is great. And for sure, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that when that launches.
Oh, I
So
hope so.
of course, pick up Wolf's all of his, I mean, you can't possibly get all of his educational stuff because it would take you a lifetime to acquire all of the stuff. But right now,
Sorry
you
about
should
that.
get his TrueFire course
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah.
get his
Please
jazz
do.
language book because that's stuff that's pretty happening right now. But thank you so much for being here with us, Wolf. For
My
everybody that
absolute
tuned in,
pleasure.
appreciate it. This
Thank
will
you
be
so much.
posted on the YouTube channel. So maybe how would you like to play a little something for us? Play us out. Give us a little Wolf playing on something.
Well, here's a tune that you can use some shell chords in called Lush Life. If I played, let's say, all
you.